And I feel so lucky that you guys pamper us with all these packages and the beautiful programs. And I'm like so inspired.
What's your name?
Farbrengen.
What's your name?
It's Basmat.
Oh, hi. I'm Esty. I was emailing you.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I feel like it really brings a lot to the home.
Okay,
Wow.
Baruch Hashem.
You're a new face.
Beautiful.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Haven't
Thank
seen
you.
you before. Hi, Chavi Rappaport here.
Thank you. Well, I didn't really get to go to any of the Nishay stuff. So, like,
When did you move here?
I moved like a while ago, but Baruch Hashem, with the little kids and the husband,
You're a
not
little
really
busy. Okay, we understand.
So thank you. I was really excited for the Farbrengen tonight too.
Okay, so we're going to open. I want to thank Basmat for mentioning that, because one of the things that is, like, for me, a very difficult part of COVID is that I miss you guys. I do really miss you guys. I don't see you enough. So I want to give a gracia shekayach to Esty and to Goldie for keeping us together in this way and putting these events together. Every single time she sends me another one, I just have to give her a yeshikayach. Thank you, thank you, thank you for keeping us together. Thank you. Because I miss you. I can't wait to see you properly, like, you know, face to face. But yes, thank you, Basmat, for that. So we're going to start with the Rosh Chodesh Kislev Niggin. Everybody, please join me. Ladies, do you remember when that was possible? When all that dancing took place and we were all together, like people were so close? Oh, just chalish for that to come again, okay? Should come speedily. Okay, now I want to welcome everybody and thank Lilach Reinitz and the Reinitz family for sponsoring this event in memory of her mother, Leah. And it is the 10th yahrzeit of Leah. We're going to discuss a little bit more about that later. I also want to say thank you to Goldie Grossbaum, our techie, who organized and is managing the program tonight. And you ladies should know that we had an overwhelming response for tonight's program, so we had to purchase additional Zoom capabilities. Woohoo! To Rifki Sandhouse, I want to thank you for making this beautiful flyer. To Nancy Baum, Rachel Shaw, Sarah Razel Raven, Hani Sarabransky, Lila Reinitz, Irit Rubin, Sterni Rosla, Esty Grossbaum, and Sarah Hanin, Nee Stevens, for whom we want to thank we want to first welcome Sarah back to Toronto, and we want to thank all of those people that I just mentioned now for delivering the numerous parcels. I think it's very cute because Sarah Stevens Hanin was my student. Then she was a teacher with me up here. And then we made Sheva Brachas for when she got married. And now she is part of Nashe. So I feel like this is just, you know, a life cycle in front of my eyes. It gives me a tremendous amount of nachas. Everybody should have nachas from this. Okay, we're going to say Tehillim, a Kuf test. We're using the psukim of Aleph Mem Tav. I'm going to, oh, look, cool. Beautiful, Goldie, excellent. Okay. Ashrei Samim Meidara Chaholchem B'Sairas Adonai. Ashrei Naitre Eidaisav B'Chalev Yidrushuhu. Af Lai Fa'alu Avla B'Drachav Halachu. Ata Tzivisa Pikudecha Lishmar Ma'ad. Achalai Yikainu Derachai Lishmar Chukecha. Az Lai Eivash Ba'abiti El Kol Mitzvaysecha. Aidcha B'Yaishai Levav Balamdi Mishpatei Tzidkecha. Es Chukecha Eshma Alta Azveini Ad Ma'ad. Mem. Ma ahafti sayrasecha kol hayayim hisichasi. May ayvai techakmeini mitzvaysecha ki li'aylam hili. Mikol malam dai hiskalti ki edvaysecha sichali. Mizakenim espainan kipi kodecha natsarti. Mikol ayrach ra kalisi raglai laman eshma devarecha. Mimishpatecha laisarti ki ata hayrisani. Man nimlet sulachiki imasecha midvashlichi. Mipikodecha espainan al kain sanesi kol ayrach shaker. And so, she's so fast, this Goldie. Okay. Tikra brinasti lefanecha Adonai kedvarcha havineni. Tavai sechinasti lefanecha keemrascha hatzileni. Taban nasafasais tehila kisalandeni chukecha. Ta'an l'shayni imasecha ki chol mitzvasecha tzedek. Tehi yadcha la'azreini ki pikodecha b'charti. Ta'avti lishu'ascha Adonai v'sarascha she'ashru'ai. Techi nafshi halalecha v'mishpatecha ye'azroni. Ta'isi kaseh oived bakesh avdecha ki mitzvasecha lai shachachti. Okay, I am now going to take great pleasure in introducing Hannah Leah Beckerman, who is going to pay tribute to our dear Leah Bas Yitzchak HaKhayim. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good Yom Tov, good Chodesh to all. I'm so excited to be here tonight with you. Thank you so much to Mrs. Lilach Reinitz for giving me this opportunity to speak about her dear mother, Leah Bas Yitzchak HaKohen, Alecha HaShalom, may her neshama have an aliyah. Thank you so much to Mrs. Esti Grossbaum and everyone involved for organizing this beautiful event for Rosh Chodesh Kislev. When the security guard in my building called me down the first time, I was so greatly surprised to see the beautiful package for my children waiting for me. Then it happened a few more times. Who was sending this? It was totally anonymous. I thought to myself, who would do such a mitzvah of chesed in such a beautiful, hidden, and humble way? Although I am not 100% certain, I feel strongly today that this was Mrs. Leah Lazar. In life, we choose what to focus on, what our perspective will be, what kind of life we want to live. Are we content going through life as victims of our environments and circumstances, going with the flow? Or are we looking for opportunities to grow and learn, opportunities to change lives, opportunities to perform chesed and to affect the world with goodness and kindness? Mrs. Leah Lazar was such a person who chose to make changing the world with acts of chesed in a regular priority in her life. I knew Mrs. Leah Lazar for a short time through various encounters and shared experiences. I worked at Beis Chaim Mushka as a teacher. She was going daily, and we had the chance to go together. I had no idea what Mrs. Lazar was doing daily at Beis Chaim Mushka, as she didn't share it with me. I soon found out that it wasn't to teach a class or assist a teacher or even mentor a student. It was simply to feed a girl and make sure she ate her lunch. I was completely in awe of such a chesed, as I had never seen or experienced this type of act before. A person left their busy schedule and life responsibilities simply to help one person daily. The Baal Shem Tov taught us that a neshama can come down simply to do one favor for another yid. Mrs. Leah Lazar's giving nature, her Avas Yisrael and Chesed shine bright at Beis Chaim as well as many places. Lilach shared with me that only at the Shiva of her dear mother did she learn from so many people how many acts of Chesed her mother did, all in a humble, hidden way, out of the limelight and out of public attention. I feel strongly that Mrs. Leah Lazar, through her personal example, was a leader, trailblazer, an advocate for goodness and kindness in our community. And as we are taught to live with the times, the Torah portion, it is instructive that the last few parashas recounted the lives of the first Jews, Abraham and Sarah, who are, of course, our role models of Chesed. Everyone knew Mrs. Leah Lazar for her great acts of Chesed, as she touched so many people's lives. And when one chooses this way of life, it affects a whole community to do the same and to follow in their footsteps. Today, we are often at home with our families and probably wondering, what Chesed am I doing? How am I impacting the world and making a der b'tachtonim? It doesn't have to be big project where we feel we are moving mountains. Hashem values everything that you are doing for your family. Cooking dinner, cleaning our home, and even giving a smile or compliment to someone. These are all acts of kindness. Being that it is Rosh Chodesh Kislev, such an auspicious day in Chabad, when we have the chance to write upon, I remembered when Rabbi Tzvi Freeman was speaking to a group of campus shluchas and suggested, when one writes upon to the Rebbe, you can actually include the chesed you did for your family. This was so amazing to me, that this too is something of so much value that can and should be reported to the Rebbe. Mrs. Leah Lazar also loved to cook and bake. She had many wonderful, delicious recipes, which she did not keep to herself. She happily shared her expertise at Neshe events and community cooking demos she presented, and through word of mouth. Many recipes are still used by women in our community to this very day. I had the chance to watch her demonstrate a challah bake for my university students at our Chabad house. She did it with so much love and joy, and she was so happy to help and guide and give herself to the girls. Her extreme love and care for the community and Beis Chaim girls was tremendous, but wasn't always seen. Much of her chesed was hidden. Even today, we see her connection to the girls, as we know a neshama is eternal. Just last year, as some of you know, I taught kindergarten at Beis Chaim. We went on Zoom. I was so excited to do a mother-daughter challah bake with the girls. I right away thought of Lilach to demonstrate her amazing challah shaping techniques. She agreed right away, and it was a success, Baruch Hashem. The same day, or it was the next day, I got a very surprising text from Lilach. To our pleasant surprise, Lilach realized the challah bake fell out on her mother's birthday. We were both blown away by this Ashkacha Pratis. Often we don't see how neshamas are still alive and with us, but occasionally Hashem gives us a clear glimpse of how a neshama is connected to us forever. It was a privilege to know Mrs. Leah Lazar. Shortly after her passing, she inspired us, my husband and myself, to launch a program called Loaves of Love, a program in which university students get to bake challah for themselves and their family, but they also bake extras to distribute to others, those in need, like the elderly at retirement homes, a friend in need of a boost, or a Jewish neighbor. The idea, of course, is not only to give to these girls, but to make them givers. Chesed is contagious, and Mrs. Leah Lazar just exuded so much chesed that she inspired others to keep the chesed going. Lilach, you are a role model for your acts of chesed in our community. You are following in your dear mother's footsteps and giving her so much nachas for being involved in so many community events, which you make sure are always so beautiful with so much love and dedication. Lastly, a bracha for all of us. May we all merit to have the strength, confidence, and ability to do acts of kindness and follow in Mrs. Leah Lazar's footsteps, who paved the road for us so beautifully in this community. May we merit the coming of Mashiach now.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much, Hanalea. I actually want to add to that. When I was 25, I can't remember how Shmiyasa was 3.5 years older, and we moved to Toronto. We had 2 small children. We were living in the first floor apartment, 5950 Bathurst, and within a few weeks of our getting to Toronto, we discovered that I actually had a tumor, the big C, and I made the very foolish decision that I was not going to tell anybody, that we were going to decide, we're going to deal with it by ourselves, my husband and I, and he was not so happy with the decision that I made, but I made this decision that we were going to do this by ourselves and we were going to figure it out. And so I went early morning every Friday for chemo, and I would go by bus. It got very cold, and I had to leave while it was still dark, but I was determined to keep it quiet. And of course, these things are never quiet, right? These things people find out, and they very respectful of my privacy. They didn't, it wasn't discussed among the community. Although the community was much smaller than it is now. Anyway, all of a sudden, I get a phone call, and a woman who I'd never seen before, who I'd never spoken to, and I didn't know her name. She asked me if when I'm going for my next chemo treatment, and I was blown away. I told her that I'm, Fridays is the day that I do it, Friday morning, so I can recover over Shabbos. So she said, well, what time do you go? So I said, I have to leave around 6:30 a.m. So she said, well, I'm picking you up 6:30 a.m. on Friday morning. And that was the first time I had ever met Leah Lazar. She drove me to the hospital, and we chatted on the way, and I felt so at ease, so comforted to have this wonderful woman who took she was very casual and easy with me, and there was no airs, no graces, just this is what I do, this is normal, I help people. And she drove me there, and I just took it for granted that she was going to drop me off at the hospital. She didn't. She parked the car. And she walked me into the chemo room. And I thought, okay, so she'll probably leave now, but she didn't. She didn't leave. She sat down next to me and she chatted with me. And then she opens up her bag and she takes out all these sandwiches that she had prepared for me, and drinks and fruit. Nothing that I had prepared for myself, of course, because we don't think of ourselves, but she thought of everything. And that was my introduction, A, to Leah, and B, to the Chesed of Toronto. And that made such an incredible impression on me. She did not know me, and she actually entered into a space where she could have, been hit, like, she stuck her neck out for me, but it was so beautiful and so carefully done and carefully orchestrated with such sensitivity to me being such a stranger in a strange town, that it blew me away. And I've always considered her one of the saviors of Toronto, like one of the pillars of Toronto, because of this incredible chesed that she had such an ease in performing. So I want to actually, there's a couple of other things I wanted to speak about with regards to chesed, because Leah stands still today. Leah stands so strongly for chesed. I have a couple of sentences, like phrases, that I tell myself. For example, kind people are the best kind of people. During this COVID epidemic, we've had a couple of WhatsApps that's been going around, and one of the WhatsApps was a man from England who I happen to know, who had a out-of-body experience because he actually left the world and came back. There was a couple of them during COVID time, and he went to the Best in Shalmaila, to the upper court, and when he came back, he said that the most incredible thing about being up in the upper world in the Best in Shalmaila was that they actually don't want to know anything about your life, not your dress, not your sheitel, not your chumash mark, and not your bank account. They want to know in the Best in Shalmaila what acts of chesed that you did during your lifetime. That is what is important. That is the only thing, actually, at the end of the day, that is important. It's the only thing that you actually take with you when you go into the next world. And he stressed that, this little short WhatsApp video. And I was there's one other angle about chesed, is that, and Hannah Leah Beckman touched on it. Like, what if, you're so overwhelmed with your own life that you actually can't do all these great big mountainous chesed, acts of chesed and stuff? Well, that brings me to my next sentence that I tell myself and I tell people around me, that basically it goes like this: if you can help, help. And if you can't help, which is fine, then at least be kind and be nice. Because that kindness and that niceness that you are going to bring out is a chesed. So if you can't help, you can't actually, package the package or deliver or take somebody else's children to the park, or because you're overwhelmed with your own life, still just be kind and be nice about it. Because that kindness and that niceness gives the other person such a dignity, and that in itself is a chesed. Don't let's lose the dignity of another person just because we can't fulfill whatever it is that person needs us to fulfill at that time. Anyway, so having said that, I want to go on to the next part of the program, which is to introduce somebody who did the ultimate chesed, and we're going to hear more about that from Mimi Rosenfeld, longtime teacher in Beis Chai Mushka, grade 2. All of our children learned by her. She gave them a whole solid grounding, and she is going to tell the story of what happened to her father on Rosh Chodesh Kislev today.
Okay, it's actually not Rosh Chodesh Kislev that I'm talking about, but thank you for the introduction. I'm actually going to speak about Shmini Atzeres 43 years ago. Do you hear me?
Oh, right, of course. Yes, you're in.
Okay. 43 years ago, I was a girl of 12 years old. I was babysitting actually that night by Hakafis so that my sister could go to Hakafis. I was babysitting my nephew. My sister on Kingston Avenue, overlooking like off Union, like near Union. So we were able to see the street. So me and my friend were watching. I would expect my sister to be coming home soon. And what do I see? People coming out of 770. Now, I was young, so I didn't really understand that it was unusual. I thought, okay, davening's over. My memories of that time are not, like, I don't really remember much. What I do remember is like going to shul the next day and seeing all the windows in the back of the shul broken and wondering, I knew what had happened by that time. My father walked to the Eihel on that day. I was told that his feet, he didn't have very good feet, but I heard he walked to the Eihel. That's basically what I remember from that time. However, many years later, when I was already married with a few children, I was told that some Hasidim got together, probably to say Tehillim, and they were very distraught. And some of them were saying that they were offering part of their life, and there was a whole discussion. I actually saw this online, but I don't know where. I can't find it anymore. And people were saying that some of the Hasidim were saying that they're giving a week, and 3 Hasidim, I was told, pledged that they were going to give up their whole life, the rest of their life for the Rebbe. All 3 passed away that year. My father was one, I was told, I never heard this specifically, but I was told that my father was one of those Hasidim that pledged and gave up his life to the Rebbe. He passed away in Adar that year, March of that year. He was 47 years old. He was a devoted Chassid. Now, I did try to find out different like proofs to it because I had never heard this before, but I was discussing it with my sibling, with my family, and it has gone around. And one of my sisters said, yeah, Tati would have said that this story grew a long colored beard. It has many, many people added to the story. I have no idea the details exactly, but what I do know, and my sister remembers this also, is my father definitely did say, "Ich will gegeben mein Leben für den Rebbe." I would give up my life for the Rebbe. Tzivos Hashem, I'm trying to see. It's Tzivos Hashem magazine. I'm a teacher, so I look up in Tzivos Hashem, and for Rosh Chodesh Kislev, they have archives, and over there in the archives, it does say, some Hasidim walked to the Ayal on Yom Tif and gave years of their lives for the Rebbe. Indeed, a short time later, they passed away. My brother, my younger brother was a little, like I think he told me he was 14 years old. He only told me this many years, like 20 years ago. So not when he was 14, many years ago. He told me that he went over to my mother when he heard this and he asked her if it was true. And she said yes. I didn't have the guts to ask her about that. And by now it's too late. She's in Eilam HaEmes. But what I want to just end with is with the same Mesiras Nefesh the Hasidim showed then. We must again do whatever it takes to be reunited with our Rebbe so that he can lead us out of this galus immediately with the Geula HaAmitis HaShlema. Thank you.
Amen. Mimi, what a powerful story. Wow. So we need to hear more about this day, from Shmini Atzeres up until Rosh Chodesh Kislev. So I am going to introduce our speaker now. This is Dr. Ira Weiss, who is commonly known as the Rebbe's doctor. He grew up in Chicago. He attended public school and Chabad Talmud Torah. He went on to Northwestern University and interned at Massachusetts General Hospital and Cardiology Fellowship at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital and Harvard School of Public Health and Medical Research. Fellowship at the National Institute of Health. He has authored a textbook on the diagnostic logic in recognizing heart rhythm abnormalities. He is Professor Emeritus Medical Faculty at the Northwestern University. His hobbies include biking, toy trains, and building models. I thought I'd add that because it was cute. Thank you, Dr. Ira, for coming, and we can't wait to hear you. Dr. Weiss, sorry, Dr. Weiss.
Thank you for the introductions. First, I want to tell you that the stories that were just told were very, very uplifting in the sense of the Mesiras Nefesh showed by Leah and by your father, who gave his will to live in exchange for the Rebbe's recovery. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of that period of time, 43 years ago. It was a time that I was not prepared for. As you can imagine, it was something that none of us were prepared for. But it began just as was described in the talks just now, that on the eve of Shmini Atzeres, unexpectedly, the very strong and forceful Rebbe suddenly became very sick. And the illness was an acute heart attack, meaning that one of his coronary arteries, or maybe several of the coronary arteries, suddenly occluded or thrombosed. And this took everybody by surprise. The Rebbe fell short of energy. They opened all the windows. They broke the glass in the windows to provide oxygen for him. They did all they could in a scramble to get him to revive some strength. And this was to little avail. I was, of course, totally unaware of this. I was in Chicago preparing, entering into the Yom Tov at the time when this began. And like all the people in the world, we went to sleep happy it was a Yom Tov and very satisfied with ourselves and optimistic that there was no problem that we couldn't surmount. At 7 the next morning in Chicago, where I live, my medical emergency phone rang. And of course, I answered this on Yom Tov or Shabbos because of the medical necessity that it might entail. The idea of Pikuach Nefesh. And it was Rabbi Yehuda Krinsky, one of the members of the Rebbe's executive secretariat. I had not ever met Rabbi Krinsky, nor had I ever met the Rebbe, but Rabbi Krinsky knew of me through a series of connections with my little Agudas Chabad Cheder that I attended all my childhood with great affection and love to my teachers, Rabbi Herschel Schusterman and his wife Chava Schusterman, who was the sister of Rabbi Krinsky. And how he called me has a long story. I won't bore you with all the details, but basically the book that I wrote on heart rhythms was written a few years, about 4 years earlier. And it was written just at the time when Texas Instrument Company has developed the integrated circuit for microcircuits in electronics. And this miniaturized all the computers from the size that were mainframe computers in rooms down to little things you could hold in your hand or have at a patient's bedside, a small little miniature version of a major computer doing the same thing. And the purpose of the book was to teach students about irregular heart rhythms, which became evident that you could save people's lives by understanding these heart rhythms and making a fast diagnosis and the appropriate therapy. Before this period, people just suddenly passed away with no explanation other than that the autopsy showed that there was a coronary or there's some injury to the heart, but no one knew exactly how they died suddenly. And it was because the rhythm suddenly went out, the heart rhythm, the cadence of the orderly sequence of events that are required for the heart beating to beat effectively. Just like you couldn't imagine the heart doing much if it was beating in a very erratic pattern. If it stopped altogether, there'd be no circulation at all. And so this book gained a lot of notice in academic circles, also in clinical circles for practitioners, but more importantly, even in the circle of people who are developing the microelectronics and the computer logic that would decipher rhythms at the time they were happening so that medical people, nurses, doctors could be immediately alerted to do something about an irregular rhythm. I didn't anticipate this. This was just a book written to help my younger brother get through medical school on a complicated subject of heart rhythm abnormalities. But I decided to send the book to my beloved mentor, Rabbi Schusterman, and his wife, Chava Schusterman, just to show what one of their Cheder students had accomplished years later. And they were very happy to receive the book. They realized it was a book that they wouldn't be able to indulge in too deeply. So they decided, instead of keeping it, they would send it on to the Rebbe by way of Rabbi Krinsky, who is Chava's brother, as I mentioned. And I didn't know about this, and of course, they did this on their own volition. But when the book arrived at 770, the Rebbe took a look at it and was so intrigued by the logic and the mathematics and the thinking that it was involved with the deciphering these complicated heart rhythm abnormalities that he decided to keep it in his study, even though his study, as you know, was not a very big place and it had limited bookshelf space. It was one of the books on his shelf. I didn't know this, but he had looked it over, and the name, my name was somehow familiar to Rabbi Krinsky and to the Rebbe, although I never had met either of them. So the issue was this: at the time of the heart attack, the Rebbe clearly brought out and explained to his attendants, which are the secretariat and all the people, including the doctors who happened to be in the building at the time at 770, he explained to them that he wanted to stay at 770 for his care, even though the doctors who happened to be there all explained to him that you need to be monitored with these fancy monitors and be wired up and have all kinds of tools of the trade to defibrillate. If you lose your heart rhythm, you could be defibrillated right away without loss of life, and this and that intravenous drug, and none of this was available in any form at 770. Yet the Rebbe insisted that he wanted to be cared for at 770. And every one of the doctors there said this is not in keeping with the Rebbe's way of thinking. The Rebbe is usually so clear in making sharp decisions that make sense, and even to the common person, they make common sense. And to those who are a little more abstract, they make more intricate sense, but this didn't make any sense to them at all. Rebbe Schneerson was called down to talk to the doctors, and she, after talking to the Rebbe, said, my husband is one who always thinks things over so carefully and considered that she is going to stand by his opinion that he must stay there. And the doctors pleaded with her and with the Rebbe that please let him go to a hospital, otherwise he has the risk of losing his heart rhythm or his life or whatever. So the Rebbe, in the course of the evening, did more poorly and more poorly and more poorly, so to the point that his blood pressure sagged in such a manner, his cardiac output performance sagged in such a manner that he was no longer really sustaining his circulation in the brain to be able to converse. So he kind of went under. He didn't die, but he lost his ability to communicate at the time. It was not a stroke. It was not any brain damage. It just was a low pump output from the heart, meant low performance from all the tissues that it was supposed to supply, including the brain. And I was being given a call in desperation by Rebbe Krinsky, who knew of my name and knew of me just through the book and through my connection to the Schustermans. Rebbe Krinsky was coming with a question for me. He said, Dr. Weiss, we're calling you out of the clear blue here to tell you about the Rebbe. And I was so heartbroken, even though I wasn't attached to the Rebbe the way a chassid is attached, or the way someone who knows what he has done is attached. But I said that I can tell you that from an ethical standpoint, I do hold by what the Rebbe says, that certainly if he made this opinion so clearly to himself, to the public, and to his wife, and he's standing by this, and now he's not empowered to stand up for his opinion, I don't think we could logically or morally take him off in an ambulance to find himself waking up in a hospital the next morning. Yet he does need immediate care, otherwise he's likely not to pull through, God forbid. So I told Rebbe Krinsky that my suggestion would be to follow some of the teachings of my professors who trained me in Boston. These were great professors of cardiology who were given the responsibility of saving heads of state, heads of major corporations in any part of the world you can name. And I was witness to one of these efforts. The Baroness de Rothschild needed a new valve, and the only place to do it right was in New Zealand. And we had a team of our group go with her by plane to New Zealand with a little coronary care set up in her private plane, which took her across to New Zealand in a series of steps. And during that time, she did have a cardiac arrest, and we were on hand to defibrillate her. So I saw that this can be done in the most peculiar circumstance. And I told Rebbe Krinsky about my experience and the experience of our teachers who took care of the presidents when they got sick. You know, Eisenhower was one of them. And Kennedy, John Kennedy, had a very critical illness that no one knows much about. Privately, it was a very big illness, and we had a special team of doctors taking care of John Kennedy, even though he was a young man. I said, this can be done and this can be arranged. Why don't you, Rebbe Krinsky, find the people who could do this for the Rebbe and set this up for him just as he requested, and do it on the double, b'mheira b'yameinu. And Rabbi Krinsky called me back 5 minutes later. He said, Dr. Weiss, I looked high and low. I talked to all the people here. No one knows of anyone in New York who would be capable of making this type of assembly of equipment and the know-how, and then having a team of doctors who would be manning this unit. So we're just short of anyone who could do it. And he said to me, Dr. Weiss, could you be the one who comes in from Chicago to set up this coronary care unit for the Rebbe, as per his request and as per the need for something to be done immediately. And I told Rabbi Krinsky, Chicago is a 2-hour plane ride from New York City. Furthermore, in Chicago, we live an hour from the airport and the parking there is terrible, so there's another half hour. Getting a plane right when you want isn't always available. They didn't have a plane a minute, they had a plane an hour maybe to New York. And also the trip from the airport in New York, in LaGuardia, to Crown Heights can be sometimes tedious. And I didn't even know exactly where Crown Heights was on the map, but I figured it was a good sized ride from Queens to Brooklyn. But Yoro Krinsky said, we have no one else to turn to. Could you please come in? And then as he told me this, my heart sunk not only for the Rebbe, but for myself out of selfishness. I said, you know, I just this past year was recruited from Boston to be a cardiologist here in Chicago. I have 2 little children, 2 baby children, and a wife. She will never understand. My employers at the hospital where I work at Northwestern University, they won't understand. They'll certainly fire me almost on the spot. And I don't have even much savings in the bank to accommodate such changes suddenly in life. And I don't have anyone to help me take care of the Rebbe, or know anyone in New York that I can count on that could come through. I'm taking a mission like Avraham Avinu took when he was asked to sacrifice his son, with that type of feeling that you're just going into a deep pit with the whole project. But then I had a flash of thought. I remembered that one of my most brilliant and kindest teachers in Boston had been given the privilege of becoming the chief of cardiology at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan. It's a very fine hospital, very academic, fine hospital. The only problem is that I didn't have such a close friendship with him that he could suddenly drop what he was doing to take care of things. He was a Jewish and very kind-hearted and clear-thinking man, but he was never affiliated with Lubavitch. He had never met the Rebbe. He didn't know much about Chabad. And his manner of Jewish practice was that of a very decent human being who really observed the mitzvah of Yehavta l'reacha kamocha to the nth degree, but wasn't one who followed all the other commandments that we're familiar with. So I said, he's not going to take this call very well. And also, as you all know, if you've ever called a hospital or any institution, you call and then you have to press button 1 and then button 2, and then he's in a meeting, and then there's a procedure, and then someone's on the table for surgery and he's there as the surgeon. How would that ever possibly be a call I'd have answered right when I need to run to the airport? And I had actually not run to the airport, run to the bank to get the cash for it. We didn't have credit cards then. There were credit cards, but we were the schleppers who didn't have the credit cards. So I had to wait for the bank to open at 9 o'clock Chicago time. So everything was a mess. And when I got on the phone with the operator, and in those days, the switchboards weren't electronic. They were patch cords like you see in old movies, old black and white movies. The operator was a lady who was very dignified. She listened to my story. She certainly heard in my voice there was an important urgency in this matter. She got out of her chair, left the switchboard, ran down the hall to get my friend, Dr. Louis Tischholz, and actually literally probably had to pull him by the ear to get up from his bench and come and take the phone call. But she did it, and he came there, and to my shock and amazement, he said, Ira, that's my first name, Ira, I would do this because you sound like you really have a pickle here. And I said, Dr. Tischholz, if you could really do this and recruit the equipment and bring the know-how and technology right to the Rebbe's 770 location in his private study, I'll get on the plane, but it's going to be 4 or 5 hours till I see you. So you'll need to have a lot of success till I get there, because 4.5 hours on the Rebbe's limited time scale here with the critical situation is going to be a long, long time, too long for a successful effort. And Dr. Tischel says, I'll do my best, Ira. I don't even know where the place is, but I'll get going. They didn't have GPS in those days, and he didn't have a road map handy. But I got on the plane and davened with all my heart. It was Shacharis for Shmini Atzeres And when I finished the brachas, the early morning brachas, I came to the Akedas Yitzchak. And when I read the part where Yitzchak was innocently asking his father, Father, Abraham, Father, I see the fire and I see the wood, but where's the sacrifice? And Abraham has to give him kind of a stopgap answer of, God will provide my son the ram. And I felt I was in such a position. My name happens to be Yitzchak, so it matched my situation that Yitzchak was perplexed, and I was very perplexed. But I did daven with the fullest heart, and I've never davened like that then or since then, except once for one person's illness. I once went as far as I did on that airplane ride. When I got off, I was spirited by the davening, but then I was immediately dispirited when I went to get the taxi cab to get to Crown Heights, because when I went up to the dispatcher for the taxi cab at LaGuardia, he announced that they have been under directive of the city of New York not to send any taxi cabs or livery services into Crown Heights, because just a week or so before there was a interracial murder and the streets were dangerous. The cabbies were advised they would end up losing their cabs, have all their windows smashed, and endanger their own lives or the lives of their passengers trying to take someone into Crown Heights. So I asked the dispatcher, what's the alternative? I can't get there, as fast as I want, but how would you do it? He said, well, I would get on a Queens bus to Jackson Heights in the Queens, which is a good schlep of a ride, and then get 2 subways that will connect you right to the door of Kingston and Eastern Parkway. I said, really? Kingston and Eastern Parkway? I thought I was in luck. I thought maybe I was just going to get a train right to the door. No, it was going to be about a 2-hour ride, they estimated, if I was very lucky in catching the bus on time. I said, that's not going to work. And so I decided I would do something that violates the New York law, which is you're really not allowed to ask anyone in the airport to give you a ride. And certainly if anyone's offering a ride, don't give them business, because you'll both get potentially arrested or at least apprehended. I said, I can't listen to these rules. I'll just go find someone who has the mercy to take me to Crown Heights. And as I was going around getting nowhere, I was suddenly apprehended by the police. It just as expected. And they say, are you Dr. Weiss? And I was perplexed. How would they know my name? They said, we have been called by Rabbi Krinsky in New York, in Crown Heights, that we need to find a doctor who looks like he might be an Orthodox Jew. I don't carry a beard, but I did have the kippah. And so on Yom Tov, Rabbi Krinsky advised them that no one in their right mind who is Jewish is going to be walking around with a kippah in the airport. So that all you need to find is the man wearing the kippah or the hat, and that's Dr. Weiss. So they spotted me right away, and they were spot on correct. They took me to the police escort, and we flew on the highway right into New York. And when we got there, it was a sad scene because there was a sea of people, all so downtrodden, all wearing their black kapotas as if it were worse than you could think, the event that you didn't want to think about. And I said, oh, maybe I came too late and this was the end, and I made this trip in vain. But then they started splitting the people. The police made it possible for me to split the Red Sea. And no sooner did I start walking through the crowd than a big chassid. I'm a 6-footer, but the chassid was about a 6.5-footer and much heavier than I am, about twice my weight. And he jumps me. And I said, oh, what's this all about? Well, I think he was responding to my youthful look, because when I got out of the police escort, I saw all the people's faces become even more downtrodden because I looked very young at the time. I look very old now because I am very old. But in those days, I was easily 10 years younger in appearance. So I was 33 and looked 23, which means 10 years out of the bar mitzvah comes the big expert who's going to save the Rebbe from Chicago. And this didn't take well with the crowd. They saw right away this wasn't going to work. And this little kid is coming off, this inexperienced little kid who doesn't know what he's doing is going to be in charge of making sure the Rebbe gets back on his feet again. And I thought I was being jumped to maybe put me down so I wouldn't be going there to poison the Rebbe with my inexperience. But it turned out it was a very fine man from South Africa. And when he said his name, I recognized it right away that 2 years or so before, when I got married, we got a phone call from South Africa from this person telling me that his wife was in serious trouble after childbirth. There was a problem of infection and she was really losing her life. And I said to him, it happens that I know the chief of infectious disease at your hospital in South Africa. All we need to do is contact him. And then I get a call back that the man, the doctor who's such an expert on how to save people like this, the infectious disease expert, he's on a safari in Kenya and can't be reached. And I got word of what the man's name was. And I've said, you know, I told my wife, Myra, you know, when we were courting and I used to come by your apartment, there was a big apartment building where you lived, and I saw this exact name on the doorbell, on one of the doorbells. And I bet she might have been a graduate student at Harvard at the time where we were living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Maybe, who knows, maybe she's related to the doctor. So I go over to the apartment building that was right down the street from where we live. And lo and behold, that's his daughter. And she told me she has a way by using shortwave radio in South Africa to reach him. And that's how they got hold of him. He miraculously was able to give perfect advice and save this lady's, and I was being thanked now physically with this humongous hug, in which was very heartwarming, but it was also jarring in the sense that I thought they were trying to put me down and smother me. And I got to the door, there was Rebbetzin Schneerson, such a great, wonderful, graceful, lovely person. And she said, Dr. Weiss, I want to reassure you that your friend Dr. Tischholz came in from Mount Sinai Hospital and had all the right equipment to get my husband's blood pressure running and to restore some aspects of his heart rhythm and to restore his level of consciousness so he's just like he was before this got. And he's also feeling better because of some medications that Dr. Tischholz had up his sleeve. He had the magic touch, obviously. He's a very, very fine man. He's the real hero of the story. I'm just telling you how we got hold of Dr. Tischholz. And I was very relieved to hear this. I said, Rebbetzin, I'll go down to see the Rebbe with Dr. Tischholz and I'll come back up. She invited me for Kiddush because it was Shmini Atzeres. And the Rebbetzin said, no, no, Dr. Weiss, let's make Kiddush first and then you'll see my man. I said, Rebbetzin, the Rebbe is very critically sick. She said, really, he has been stabilized by your friend Dr. Tischholz. Make Kiddush first, make a short Kiddush, and then see him. So I had to follow her instruction. I wasn't exactly excited about spending any time except to go to see the Rebbe. But it was a very, it was a short little Kiddush for Yom Tov, as you know, but it was very meaningful. And I went to the Rebbe with a very positive attitude that his wife had made sure I made Kiddush first. And there was the Rebbe. And it was such the initial contact was such an impact because he was really, as you know the Rebbe, as you folks know the Rebbe, is someone who has such a wonderful way of looking into your eyes and thinking about your problems. And more amazingly, even though he had been critically sick and so hypotensive that he couldn't even talk hours before Dr. Tischholz got there, that he began to think about the heart attack, asked us what it was, and I explained to him the heart, which has these globular ventricles that contract, as you all know, and do the pumping. One whole side of the heart had become dead from a blocked artery or blocked arteries, and the rest was doing all the work. It's like having your labor force at the factory drop out, 50% go on strike, and suddenly you're asked to still make the same number of products. And that's what the Rebbe's pickle was. He was in that kind of pickle. And the Rebbe asked, well, what do you do about the heart part that's not contracting? I said, well, we let it become scar tissue around which the rest of the heart will do all the work. And he said, well, what about the part that should be working too? I said, we don't have a way of bringing that back anymore. And the Rebbe immediately came back with the idea, well, have you doctors been using anything like stem cell transformation? Stem cell research had just been opened at that point in that very year, 77. And there were reports that the Rebbe had read, because the Rebbe read journals like Nature and Science. If any of you are scientists, you'll know that these are premier journals that people who are really sophisticated scientists read. And most of us don't really see these journals, but the Rebbe had Nature and Science in one of the drawers in his office. Even though it's a little office with limited space, that was among his important reading material, and he kept abreast of these things. We had to confess, Dr. Tischholz and I said, we apologize, Rebbe, but we have not heard about stem cell research, especially as applied to the heart. And as luck would have it, 10 years later, it became one of the standard ways of trying to build up heart muscle, and now is becoming more and more a potential technology. But the Rebbe was already thinking about this 43 years ago and way ahead of us. Well, it didn't get him any better. It was just an interesting conversation. So the Rebbe went to the next level to think as a mechanical engineer. As you know, his training included physics. He trained in Berlin in physics under 2 Nobel laureates, one of whom was Erwin Schrödinger, who was the pioneer of the whole wave equation, the Einsteinian physics. and the Rebbe was his star student. And Schrödinger, even though he had to sign up with the Nazi Party to stay in Germany, kept in regular correspondence with the Rebbe all the time till Schrödinger passed away. That's how much he was affected by his student, Rebbe Schneerson. And then he studied mechanical engineering in the Sorbonne. So he had a very good idea about the mechanics. So his idea was this. As a child, he used to be fascinated by soap bubbles. If you've ever played with them as a child, you know, blowing in your bubble pipe, you keep blowing and blowing until they stretch out, and then they pop. And the reason they pop is that the wall gets thinner, but more importantly, the pressure inside the little soap bubble gets too strong and can't be retained. You can do the same thing with an automobile tire. You can take it to the gas station and overinflate it, and you will be able to break the tire apart. In other words, the wall becomes tenser and tenser as you put more air in. So the Rebbe reasoned that if you load the heart up with too much fluid and stretch it, the weak muscle that's left will have a much harder job contracting when the pressure inside the heart is so much higher. And he said to us, he taught us as a physicist that if you keep the heart as small as possible, you'll have the most chance of getting the most out of this residual muscle. I'm not trying to give you a physics course, but I think it's conceptually easy to grasp what the Rebbe was driving at. And he said that, how would you make the heart smaller? So he asked us as cardiologists. What? Dr. Tischholz and I both answered that if you kept the salt intake down in the diet, you won't retain as much fluid, because salt is like a great blotter. It's used for koshering for that reason. It kind of blots out the blood when using the koshering process. So he said if you probably refrained from using food that requires koshering and stayed with things like fish, which doesn't require koshering, or use kosher products in a small amount just to acknowledge Yom Tov and Shabbos, you'll really remarkably reduce your salt intake. And the Rebbe loved salt. By nature, he was one who would add salt when the occasion arose. So he radically transformed on his own volition and with the help of the Rebbitzin, who is ultra sharp like he is. And they reduced the sodium in the diet. And actually, with measurements we took with echocardiograms, we showed that he brought his heart size down to about 3/4 or half the size it was before, which allowed all these muscle fibers that were trying to do all this work have a much easier time. Just like the tire that's underinflated won't have such high tension on the wall. It's like giving someone a lighter assignment where they have a weak limb so they can do the assignment. And it gave him a leg up on surviving this, because we had to admit to ourselves when we knew that he pulled through and we looked at the cardiogram and saw the extent of the damage. I said, most people are lucky if they survive it, let alone are functional in any real capacity after a heart attack of this extent. I said, we are not in for a good ride here, because we might save the Rebbe's life, but he won't be the Rebbe anymore. And in fact, this was brought out when I was asked right the next day to talk to the Farbrengen assembled, the people assembled in 770 to give a report on the Rebbe. And they were meeting me, face to face in a sense for the first time. And I couldn't lie and say that nothing happened, but I couldn't tell the whole story either, because if you were told that the Rebbe has had a very serious heart attack with a loss of the potential to gain back his physical stamina and strength, no one in the right mind would bother him with any shaila or any question or any petition, because you wouldn't trouble someone who is having such trouble. It just wouldn't be your nature to do that. I said, we have to be careful in what we say. I told the public that we really are happy to say that the Rebbe pulled through the crisis with stabilizing his heart rhythm and his pressure. There's a lot of recovery that's necessary, but I didn't go into the gory details, including the actual ultimate truth that we haven't seen patients function that well after such an extensive heart loss. And naturally, we kept in our hearts, with all our hearts, both Dr. Tischholz, who didn't use the formality of prayer in the siddur, and I, who used the formality of the siddur, really in our own way davened with all our hearts for the Rebbe, but this was not enough of a solution. The Hasidim, trying to test to see where I'm coming from, said, Dr. Weiss, give us a nigun. And this is on Shmini Atzeres. This is on Simchas Torah. And I wasn't really that schooled in Lubavitch. I'd gone to a little Lubavitch cheder and had wonderful teachers, but I had not been to a Farbrengen. I didn't know the nigunim. But as luck would have it, my wife, who had taught at Wellesley College in Wellesley, Massachusetts, had a student of hers who once invited us for tea at her home, and she happened to watch TV, and she was watching the public television network PBS, and they had a program on religions of the world. And in that moment, at that day, it just happened, as luck would have it, they had a program on Lubavitch. And there they showed a very dear chassid named Leibel Bishkrivsky calling people on the street where his market was in the Lower East Side for mincha. And then the next scene was the Lubavitcher Rebbe singing Hoshia Es Amecha. And the song caught my ear, and I remembered how he did it, how he sang it. And on that platform, when they asked me for a report, I knew Hoshia Es Amecha and gave it with the full vigor that the Rebbe would give it. And that convinced the Hasidim that I was the right person for this job. And you might say, well, it's a sort of a strange and corny story, but really it mattered a great deal to the Hasidim that they would have some confidence in the doctor team, that the doctor would at least know a little about the Rebbe or the Rebbe's perspective or the Chabad perspective. And singing Hoshia Es Amecha on Simchas Torah was just the right song at the right moment. And it was only because I was at someone's house with the television going, and who knows that I would not seen it, how I might have looked, or how my story might not have been accepted. The gory details of all the things we did, I might just say, you might say, well, what was so special about the care besides the Rebbe's input? Well, I have to admit that Dr. Tischholz came up with some brilliant ideas. One of the things was Dr. Tischholz was one of the people who was involved with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So he helped develop what was called telemonitors, something unheard of in the general medical profession. But he had helped develop this for the space program, for our rockets going out into outer space, and even the moon launch and all this. These were little devices that you wear pasted on your skin, and they transmit radio signals to receivers, and that transmits the signal back to some station that's watching your heart rhythm. Well, the Rebbe was wired up that way. And all other patients in all hospitals, even the greatest hospitals in the world, had the patients strapped in bed with these big, heavy, clumsy wires going all over the place. And if you can imagine what it might have been like to ask to go to the bathroom with that, you have the answer in your own mind of what that was. It was just a total tie-up, as if you were wrapped up with wires in bed, and that's the cardiac care you're going to get. The Rebbe didn't have any part of that. In fact, he even wore his kapot instead of a hospital suit, so he looked like a Rebbe. And he was carefully attended to, just looking like the Rebbe as we know him. And it was such a matter of a difference in dignity between even the greatest and most wonderful hospitals and how the Rebbe was cared for as a real human being. Furthermore, we had a unit that had one doctor on at a time, but that doctor was also the pharmacist. He's also the one who recorded the progress notes. He's also the one who took all the vital signs. In other words, you didn't have the potential of miscommunications where the nurse said, oh, I didn't get that order right, or I made a mistake on the dosage. One doctor of our team, we had a team at that time of 5 doctors, was in charge of doing everything for a period of not more than 4 hours, so there would be no fatigue, plus an hour on each, half hour on each end to pass on the baton. So we engineered something that was not available in the hospitals. When I was an intern at Massachusetts General Hospital, I was contracted to work 36 hours of really intensive work, and then he was given 12 hours off, all that way for 2 straight years. And you can imagine there were times when I just was at my wit's end of how I'm going to recruit enough energy to think out the problem properly. We did exactly the opposite. We limited the work time to 4 intensive hours where no mistakes are made by the transcription errors, or I didn't get the order straight, or I don't know what the nurse had in mind, or the nurse didn't have what I had in mind. So we had a different system of medical care that was superior to what's available in the normal medical system. Also, we had the support of an immensely helpful secretariat. I mentioned Rabbi Krinsky, who was at the forefront of this effort, and also Rabbi Binyamin Klein of blessed memory was a very dear member of this 3-man team, as was Rabbi Leibel Brodner of blessed memory. And I don't know if any of you people have heard these names, but they were really at my right hand, and Dr. Tischholz's right hand, and my professor Bernard Lown's right hand. Dr. Bernard Lown was brought in from China by the State Department when they heard about the heart attack, because he was on a research mission there, and they knew the importance of the Rebbe to the State Department. I never asked what was that importance, but obviously the Rebbe had his finger on a lot of things going on around the world. And to the U.S. State Department, he was a critical member of their advisory, or their panel of people, consultants. And so they wanted him alive so he could help with projects that were going on that I have no idea about. And then there were other doctors. The doctor in the neighborhood, Dr. Robert Feldman, was an outstanding, kind, and thoughtful and very energetic man who put a lot of his time in to help us. He was not the academic that some of my other colleagues were, but he was certainly a wonderfully good worker, helper, and thinker. I also met up with another doctor brought in by the US military, and they shipped him from being the head of the military hospital for the Navy in Honolulu, Hawaii, to become the head of a unit in Staten Island, so that he could take care of the Rebbe. His name was Larry Resnick of blessed memory. And it turns out that out of clear blue, Larry is from Chicago, and we remember each other as little children who used to run out when the Torah was being read on Shabbos so we can punch each other and fight and scream and yell outside the shul, as children have to do. So here was my screaming and punching partner now working with me on the Rebbe, and he was a very qualified, smart, and helpful doctor. So we had a very nice team of cooperative doctors. We took these trading shifts, and we did the Rebbe's care over the 6 or so weeks in the little unit we created. And when it came time to Shabbos Mevorchim, for Shabbos Mevorchim Kislev, the Rebbe, it would be actually Cheshvan, Shabbos Mevorchim Cheshvan, we were asked by the Rebbe that he had made a solemn promise to his father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, that when it was Shabbos Mevorchim, he would always have a Farbrengen. This was a rule of thumb, a rule. And the Rebbe wanted to abide by it, but here he was tied up with us in this little corner care unit in his study, unable to fulfill the promise. So he made an idea that he could broadcast by radio to his community Motzei Shabbos that night. Instead of having a Shabbos Farbrengen, he have a Motzei Shabbos radio broadcast. And I told the Rebbe, we have to be very careful because it's an unknown for us how provocative this might be to your own sense. You might become very prone to irregular heart rhythms, and who knows what might happen. So let's limit it to 12 minutes. And I said, I'll be the timekeeper. I'll be like the radio station technician who takes you off the air when the cut comes on your time schedule. Kind of like a Zoom meeting. You come in at 8:01, you're dead. Come in at 8:00. So the Rebbe is giving the talk. He's very, very engaged and very, very emotionally taken by the fact he's communicating for the first time with his Hasidim, and they're listening on the radios. It was an AM station, trying to tune in perfectly so they could hear every word and every sigh. They wanted to hear every breath he's taking, know what he was all about. There was no way of seeing what the Rebbe was doing. And I'm standing there, and the Rebbe keeps talking. It's 12 minutes, 13, 14, 15, 20 minutes. And I say, Rebbe, I was pointing to him, we got it. And I couldn't quite pull the broadcasting device, the microphone out of his hand. And then at 25 minutes, he gives in to returning it back to me and gives me a wink. If you've ever seen the Rebbe give you a wink, it's a magic experience by itself. But with that wink, he canceled all debts he owed me about having transgressed. And it was a very magic moment, and we had such a laugh over it. And luckily, he did do well. He did actually. His heart rhythm was stable enough. And then came Rosh Chodesh Kislev. I was now back in Chicago, and Dr. Resnick was on duty at that moment, and he walked the Rebbe partially the way home because we were releasing him from his unit because he had been stable enough to be released. And he said a very beautiful word to Dr. Resnick and repeated it to me later when I came back on my follow-up visit. He said that the real victory of Rosh Chodesh Kislev, which we're celebrating right now, the real victory was not making such great medical progress. The real victory was being reunited to have the privacy of time with his wife, Rebbe Schneerson. He said, although we've had time to have tea together in the late afternoon in the coronary care unit, it's not private time, and I'm wired for sound with all these monitors and all this, and I have an IV in and all this. This way I'm home to have a little private time and quietude with my wife. And as he explained to me personally a little later after he told Dr. Resnick what made him so happy, he told me that having this private moment every afternoon with his wife to have tea and have a chance to discuss things with her was as important to him as the mitzvah of putting on tefillin in the morning. And it struck me that, a Rebbe who's so committed to his wife as well as to his Jewish practice, this is the best combination of a person. That, you have to have both of these things to be a full person. That you have to have a commitment to your wife and you have to have a commitment to your family. And I mention this as something as a standard. I often tell younger crew like Bochrim that when they're looking for a wife, they should think that way of the engagement is not just to be with the wife, but to be part of her life and vice versa. And it's a very profound thing that the Rebbe said, very important. It would do so much good for all of us if we all thought the way the Rebbe thought. And the fact is, it's hard to do. The world spins around you. There are crises, and there's this and that distraction. Even with all the things buzzing around the Rebbe's head and all the things that he took care of in the whole world, he found that kind of time somehow, or he just designated it and let himself be refreshed by being with Rebbetzin Schneerson, and then come back to the world and be tortured by all the demands and requests and responsibilities. I want to mention a little bit about Rebbetzin Schneerson, since you are all Eishes Chayil material. She was the fullest example of this. Her manner of dress was that of the most quiet elegance. She dressed in a manner of quiet elegance. It was very refined clothing. She would always dress in the most refined way. And it wasn't just because I was visiting. She was dressed like that all the other days too, I was told by the house steward, Rabbi Chesed Halberstam. She was also very curious intellectually. She would take a ride on her own, drive her own car towards Bryant Park, the neighborhood in New York, downtown near the New York Public Library. And there she would study books in science, and in her field, architecture. She would bring some of them home. She even had a little video a VHS player to play some science videos that she rented from, took out from the library. And she kept abreast of a lot of things that you would never expect that she would have an interest in. She was also had a circle of friends that were very intellectual. They discussed world politics, matters of the world, and they spoke all kinds of languages. I can't even tell you all the languages I heard in that house, but there were many. She was also very kind to my little children. My second daughter, Becky, was a little bit of a Dennis the Menace type. She would, go into the house and start looking around on her own. And one day we're sitting there with the Rebbetzin, sitting on her couch, with her on a couch, and we suddenly hear the clatter of pottery or something breaking in the china closet. And the Rebbetzin didn't lose it at all. She just simply said, I think something's going on with little Becky by the china closet. She just talked that way, went over there, and they had a very good exchange. She brought little Becky a cookie, and of course there was some broken material that probably would normally make us howl and screech if it happened to us. But she was as cool as a cucumber. And every Hanukkah, she would remember my little children with a little Hanukkah gelt on the 5th day, in a very, very beautifully written little checks with a little note on the checks, which I've kept. We didn't cash them, but we are holding. So there's a little cash each year we should have put in the bank, but we did a better job of keeping the checks. And on and on the stories went, but it was such a elevating experience to be the Rebbe. In regard to myself personally, I came back to Chicago and, as expected, did lose my position right away. I had left without leaving coverage. I noticed that I couldn't even give. I was just running to the airport without even telling anyone that I was leaving. And I accepted, I think, a very fair decision on the part of the people who hired me, that they had every right to do that. But I wasn't much of a person who could set up a business or a practice. And I decided I'm going to be an independent practitioner who doesn't have to work and obey all the rules of a group practice or a hospital practice. So I made a rule that I would set up a practice that would not in any way have a billing aspect to the patients. If they didn't have anything for me, that was good. If their insurance fell short, that was okay. But I would just have a secretary who would help file an honest insurance claim whenever it was available. And you might say, well, didn't I go bankrupt because I didn't have much cash reserve in the bank either? But it was actually perfectly good. I lived a totally normal life with the normal things that we all do, a little vacation once a year, and a modest little vacation, lived modestly, but had a very much happier experience with patients who didn't feel threatened by the costs. I know you're privileged to live in Toronto, and I must commend Canada for its very, very effective medical system. I mean, every medical system has its flaws and shortcomings, and I hear complaints that you can't get elective surgery done unless you want to wait a half year. But I think that's trivial considering the kind of care that I have seen given to friends of mine who've lived in Montreal and in Halifax. And I imagine Toronto, although it's its own province. Ontario, it might have a different system than in Nova Scotia or Quebec. But I would think that it's a system far superior to what we have in the United States, where people are threatened about being insurable, having all kinds of restrictions on what insurance is going to cover, bankruptcies left and right because of humongous costs befall people unexpectedly when something tragic happens. And in Canada, they've solved that problem by being fair to its citizens. I know you pay tax for that, but believe me, it's a comfort to me to know that you're covered that way by your government. And I would commend the people who thought this out in Canada and probably in Great Britain and other European countries that are following this pattern. So I just want to mention that I try to do it the way Canada does by not having anyone feel threatened. But I think it works well. And I was very happy with the idea. And this came about because I was forced to become an independent practitioner who worked at a university as a teacher, but not as a practitioner. So that had a good aspect to the story as well. I don't want to keep boring you with all these details, so I thought maybe I could stop now unless you want me to pursue a little bit more about the details of the Rebbe's engagement with the books that were taken from his library or stories like that. I'm happy to talk a little bit about them. But if I'm boring you to tears, I don't want to be in the position of making you feel uncomfortable. And also, I'd have to show up at another meeting, one that's going to be held I have to even remember what city it's in, Houston, Texas, and that comes up in about 10 minutes. So I would like to give some time for you to ask me some questions, if there are any questions, or if I don't want to put you on the spot. But would anyone want to volunteer to ask me a question?
Well, first of all, I would love to tell you how incredible your story is and what an impact it's having on myself, and listening to all the details and the hashgacha practice that you bring in, and your very humble way that it's just an incredible inspiration for us to see how you took that situation and made it into something so incredible and so beautiful, and that your life has been, even though it took a turn that you weren't quite expecting, but because of your dedication to our Rebbe, you turned that situation into something remarkable.
Yes,
so
this turn is the opportunity of a lifetime. I think maybe each and every one of us, if we look carefully at what goes on in our own lives, sometimes is given an opportunity. It's easy to pass it by. It would have been easy for me to tell Rabbi Krinsky, I'm afraid it makes no sense for me to come in. And it didn't make any sense, as you heard the story, it didn't make any sense at all. But sometimes these opportunities come up and you have to say, the necessity arises and I have to fulfill a responsibility that I wasn't expecting or not even qualified or prepared for. But under these conditions, I'm sure people fighting wars are sometimes in the bunkers having to do dramatic things that you can't expect of a human being, or a success that you would never be able to predict. I don't want to cut you off by this long response to your question, but it is just what you said. It's something that I would not have wanted to pass me by if it came up. I could tell you my own father, who was a very humble blue-collar laborer, was headed for, early death working in a factory steel mill, but he took to learning something that made him much more qualified to do other work. And then he couldn't join the group that he wanted to join because of lack of any funds in the family. And he won a brand new car as a Navy veteran of World War II. Just a stroke of luck that was like the Purim lottery came right for him. And it made all the difference. So I think sometimes in life you are hit with things that just will knock your socks off. It's a story that no one would want to believe because it's too fanciful. But these, I think, befall all of us if we look carefully. Any more thoughts or questions? I don't want to leave you without answering your.
Were you involved with the Didan Natsaf you mentioned?
I was involved.
Would you like to expand on that, please?
Sure. I will tell you that at Yud Tes Kislev, after Rosh Chodesh Kislev, we had our first Farbrengen. The Rebbe came out. Everyone was thrilled to the wall. Of course, Dr. Resnick and I had other thoughts. We were a little worried. So we had the Rebbe rigged up to his monitor, which meant that he was wearing something no one could see. And he had his beautiful kapota put on. He always appeared beautifully in front of people. There was nothing for people to see or suspect. And if you ever remember the arrangement in 770, we're packed like sardines there for the Farbrengen, if you ever look at the movies and all that. And the benches are long and they're commodious, where we could put our telemonitors right under there. They're battery powered, so you don't need an electric cable. And you're sitting so close that the person next to you has no idea that you're looking at a cardiac monitor while he's busy dancing and singing. And so we had a complete, and Dr. Resnick was a little bit bigger than I, and he had the ability, like a little bit more of a football player, to block the view of these things that we were watching. And to our horror, as the Rebbe began his sichot, his first Sikha in the Farbrengen. And this is after these 6 or 7 weeks of having very stable heart rhythms. To our amazement and joy, suddenly his heart rhythm decayed into a very erratic rhythm that could spell the potential for a sudden death on the stage. And Dr. Resnick and I broke into a white knuckle panic, because we said we really are obligated as human beings to go on the stage and stop this. Otherwise the Rebbe may collapse before everyone and we have to go up there to defibrillate him. Who knows if that's going to work, especially with pre-existing heart damage. We weighed the morals of it as fast as we could, and we said, you know, if we go to the stage and make the whole scene there, it'll destroy the Rebbe's ability to be a Rebbe. It was a very difficult decision, and we took the road of staying where we are and watching with white knuckle terror, hoping this would resolve. And luckily, the Sikha was not a long Sikha, and when he stopped the Sikha, the rhythm returned to normal. He said, Baruch Hashem. I gave the Rebbe some hand signals that we should not do more Sikhas. We had a little hand signal system. And the Rebbe raised a little l'chaim to me. Not listening too much to the signal, he went to the next Sikha, and the exact same thing happened. And Dr. Resnick and I said, what are we going to do if this breaks into no rhythm? Wow. And then the Sikha was not too long, and he stopped the Sikha, and the rhythm turned out normal. This happened a third time, and the same exact thing happened. He was so stirred up when he was giving the Sikha that this was doing a wild job to his heart rhythm. So I didn't know what to do, but he was going into a mimer, and I had never been to any Farbrengens before. The mimer was very soothing because the melody before the mimer put me almost into a sleep. I was so exhausted from the 3 Sikhas earlier that knocked me over mentally and physically and drained me. And then the Rebbe went into the mimer, which is also very soft and pensive. As you know, a mimer is a different tone, a different demeanor, a different quietude to the whole room. No one's stirring. And with that, the rhythm was perfect. And it was a long mimer. And we were so relieved. And we were so relieved also, the Rebbe decided at the end of the mimer that he would call an end to the Farbrengen. And he walked out proudly with a you know, he was waving his arms. I said, boy, I hope he walks out okay. I got back to the room and told him what happened. I said, I don't want to scare you, Rebbe, but it wasn't that easy for us to be at this Farbrengen, although we loved being there. We were so privileged, and we're so happy that you were there, and your Hasidim were so happy. It was a great risk. So we started to ease up on these Farbrengens until we felt the Rebbe had more time to recover the stability of his heart rhythm. So this had impact on the Vida Natzach story as follows. The opponents wanted the Rebbe to be brought to deposition. I've never been in a deposition. I've never been sued. I've never had to present anything legal like that. I'm not a legal expert. And as luck would have it, my blue-collar father, who never had an formal education, told me, Ira, you better make sure you know what your legal status is in New York, because you're not licensed there. Your only license is in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the state of Illinois. So you better go down to the law library at Northwestern where you're teaching to read yourself what the rules are if you're giving this kind of care out of state without the license in New York. And I followed my father's advice early in the game and photocopied 2 pieces of paper that were in the dense law books down at the Northwestern School of Law. And I had them in my pocket. I studied them, and it brought out that you can do consultative work in any state in the union if you're a medically licensed person in one of the states, provided you don't write the orders, provided you have other doctors write those orders and do the progress note writing. So early in the game, I had this all set up, and it was done right by the books. I had Dr. Feldman write the orders. I had Dr. Resnick write the orders. They were licensed in New York. I was not. But my input was always there, and I was mentioned in the consultative notes, and I could even write a consultation in the Rebbe's chart, which we kept very dutifully. So no one knew this. This was all done shushti unter, and I had this little document from the law library, and I was called before Judge, I think it's Judge Sifton, or it's either Silton or Sifton, who was the judge. And I was presenting my plea that the Rebbe not be brought to the deposition. And I said, I have evidence from our clinical experience, which has been documented in the chart, that the Rebbe had a breakdown of his heart rhythm when pushed so hard with an emotional stress that his heart could not bear. I said, under no circumstances would it be ethical to bring him before the court, before the judge, to give a deposition and be tortured like this. even though I myself didn't even know how bad depositions can be. They can be pretty rough. They ask you all kinds of tough questions, try to put you in the wrong corner so you can lose the case. And this then devolved to the Rebbitzin, who had to give a deposition. And it turned out the Rebbitzin was cool as a cucumber. She was very aggravated about the case, but she didn't have the heart problems. And as she did it, it's like a legend. You read about her deposition, how she explained to the judge that who owns these books is like who owns the Rebbe. It's a very, you better read it because I'm not saying it correctly, but if you read about it, you'll see how brilliantly, how cool she was and how sharp she was to give a deposition that fortunately was within her range of tolerance. And so with that, the Rebbe was exonerated. Oh, and then I went to court. And before I was even allowed to talk to the judge, they said, Dr. Weiss, can you swear by a stack of Bibles this high that you are licensed? Tell me where you're licensed. I said, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, State of Illinois. Can you tell me where you practice? And I said, in Evanston, Illinois. And they said, tell me, doctor, do you have any practice here in New York? And for that matter, do you have any license to practice in New York? And I thought that's where they're going to think they're going to catch me and not only throw me out of this, but put me behind bars for violating an important law that you can't practice medicine without a license. So I just simply and very coolly in front of the court whipped out these two papers and read the law verbatim to the judge. And it actually kind of surprised him. I'm not a legal expert and I'm not too cool in general, but I was pretty cool that day in the court, the way the Rebbitzin was pretty cool with her deposition. So the experience at the Farbrengen, the Yutes Kislev, his first Farbrengen, taught me what we had to be prepared for. And my father, the blue collar worker, taught me that I had to get knowledgeable about the law in New York. So everything always fits in.
Everything just always seems to fit in with you, and you see all those pieces, those puzzles, those details, you put them in. I want to thank you so much. I don't think we can keep you much longer, but just one last question, very quick. Sure. Would you consider writing your story so that we can, you know?
I've actually written it down for Gem, and I'm sorry to say that I've had controversies with some of the editor's staff there, because not about the story, but the manner of their writing isn't in the King's English, and I want it to be done right. I don't want to be on record for having anything but the King's English, and I know you are former subjects of the King, or the Queen, so you know what I'm talking about.
Queen's English.
I do know what you're talking about.
Queen's English, right, the Queen.
Dr. Weiss, for how long did you treat the Rebbe? Like how many years after?
So it was 15 years. I made approximately 6 to 7 trips each year. The trips were brief trips, you know, weekend trips or Yom Tov trips, brief Yom Tov trips. It was always away from my family. My family was very sad that I wasn't always with them, especially Simchas Torah, communities there at Simchas Torah, where the little girls didn't have the father to carry them on his back to parade around the Torah. But we've made up on that matter. We reconciled that. But the 15 years came to a halt when the Rebbe had a very bad stroke. And I still insist we could have done better. We didn't make the decision on how that came about, but we could have had a way of treating this. And it wasn't, one of my childhood friends was the pioneer of a method of dissolving these clots. His name was Justin Zivin of blessed memory. All of my friends have passed on, were also old. But it was.
You should have a Rifus Yamim.
You should have a Rifus Yamim.
Well, I don't know. So far, so good. But God willing. But Justin Zivin had made something that was revolutionary. Has revolutionized the ability to reverse these things. And I even laid down with my own credit card the cash for this at Cornell Medical Center, but they didn't. The ambulance trip there never got there in time for it to be useful. So I was heartbroken when we couldn't employ something that a childhood friend of mine had pioneered. And had my friend lived longer, he would have gotten the Nobel Prize in medicine. Just like you don't get a Nobel Prize after you pass away. So he was on the boards for that and didn't get it. But I would have been it was a more amazing story that my childhood friend in Chicago had developed through his own ingenuity a method of dissolving these clots that's now in standard use for these types of strokes. And so those past 2 years were very tough and emotionally very, very breaking to me to see the Rebbe suffer like that. One thing it was, we never saw the Rebbe smile much during that time, but I once brought my little Khalil along in my pocket, took out my little Khalil and played a Lubavitch Nigun that was the favorite of Rebbe Schneerson, and he cracked his own smile during that period of 2 years. Very tough 2 years.
Oh, I didn't know what a Khalil was, and I saw it written.
The desk can't
It's a
record.
little like a piccolo.
It's not a piccolo. Piccolo is much more difficult. I'm not a musically trained person, but I'll show you.
Called a recorder,
I'll
like
show
a
it
little
to you.
flute.
It's a little plastic thing. Here. This will be the show and tell session of this presentation. This is a recorder. It's a little plastic, and you just, I had it in my pocket like this. I walk in and no one knew I had it, and I know Rabbi Groner would have said, "Don't do that, you'll jar him." So I took it out, even with Rabbi Groner sitting there as my policeman, and just started playing the niggun, and the Rebbe cracked a little smile. It was a very warm moment. All of us broke into tears.
Wow.
Anyway, I want to wish all of you a good Yom Tov and a happy Rosh Chodesh going into a wonderful month of Kislev. I'll just give one little word so I won't be too late for the other meeting. And that is, with all the disruption in the world and all the things that look like we don't have a chance and it's a crisis and this and that, and how are we going to put this all back together? How are we going to get our countries back together, our leadership, put it in the right position? And I once had a series of things happening to the Rebbe that made me feel that too many things going on that were wrong. So I told Professor Herman Branover, a physicist from Israel, that Dr. Branover, I can't tell you this, but I'm bearing too much things that are going wrong all at one time. And he said, "You know, Dr. Weiss, you're all wrong." He said, "It's not how many things are going wrong, it's how many things are going right." And it was a brilliant word of a physicist. It's a way a physicist might think because of all the things that have to work for some physical aspect to happen. But it's a good way to think about things. I bet the Rebbe thought that way. I never talked to him about it because this came up and I never brought the story to his attention. But I'll give it as a little mushel that it's not how many things are going wrong, it's how many things are going right, how many things have to be working, even when you think the whole place is falling apart. It's not quite true. And with that, you might be spirited to pull yourself out of a difficult situation.
Amen. Thank you for
Thank you
spending
very
all
much.
the time with
What an
us.
honor! What an honor it was to be invited by you. I don't know that I merited the honor, but I think the story has a certain necessity to be told because as people get younger and I get older, the story might get forgotten or not understood. And this way, you can hear it right from the horse's mouth. I being the horse. Okay.
Thank you again, and Yeshikaya
so
for everything that you do and everything that
It
you
was a great
stand
honor to
for.
join all of you. And really, I was particularly touched by the early presentations and the honor being given to the person whose memory you're honoring, and the wonderful story about the young lady's father who gave us himself. So thank you for sharing that with me. And I hope I shared something with you too.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good evening. Good Yom Tov.
Good Yom Tov, good Chodesh. So
Thank you so much.
that was just incredible. He's like a wellspring of information and all of those details and all of that hashgacha pratis. He remembered the name on a door. He remembered the name, and it turned out to be the daughter of the doctor that was in Kenya. I mean, that's unbelievable hashgacha pratis. So, and he left us with a beautiful idea that even though things look really, really dark, and they do, we have to remember that things are, it's all in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hands, and nothing is for nothing, and everything will turn out right. And I'm going to make a l'chaim now on water, because that's all I have. That everybody should have a gesunte Jahr, an a freiliche Jahr, and a nachastike Jahr, and a year of Shalom, and a year of Menucha, and a year of Mashiach, of course. And we should just take all of this darkness that we are feeling right now, and it should evaporate with the coming of Mashiach now, l'chaim. Amen.
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 Amen. We sing?
Beautiful, Esther.
Abby, you gonna sing?
Yeah, I know.
One song. Esther, one song.